Hi, everybody. Okay. What abilities? There are many abilities that children need to develop to be happy and successful in life. So, for example, they need to be kind and compassionate, we hope, honest and trustworthy, to stay curious and retain a sense of wonder. Some of the most important skills, both for happiness and success in school and in life, include things like being able to stay focused and pay attention. Creative problem solving, thinking outside the box, reasoning, playing with ideas and thoughts in your mind, being able to delay gratification and stay the course, the self-control to not put your foot in your mouth, being able to resist temptations and not act impulsively, being able to take advantage of serendipity, the flexibility to adjust to change demands or priorities. All of those are executive functions. Executive functions refers to a family of mental processes needed whenever going on automatic or relying on instinct or intuition would not be a good idea. There are three core executive functions, just like you heard. I'll go through them in order. Inhibitory control involves resisting a strong inclination to do one thing and instead do what's most appropriate or needed. At the level of attention, that's focused attention. So here's a little boy in class focusing on his schoolwork, even though there's lots of distractions in the room. Another example is being able to concentrate on the person you're trying to listen to on the phone when other people are talking in the room, maybe even talking directly to you. Being able to hone in on the one thing you need, even though there's lots of distraction in the visual environment. Mirror generalization is an intrinsic property of neurons in the ventral visual stream. That enables us to recognize an object, whether it's facing to the right or it's facing to the left. When we learn to read, a component of the ventral visual stream becomes repurposed for recognizing letters and words, and that becomes known as the visual word form area. The visual word form area inherits the mirror generalization property. So that property is detrimental for the recognition of reversible letters, such as B and D or P and Q. To discriminate reversible letters, young children and even adults have to inhibit that mirror generalization. And these are a couple of the papers that report on that. But because we're able to selectively attend, we can miss important things because we were selectively attending for other things. So here's an example. Well, before I give you an example, our notions of what should happen can block us from seeing what actually does happen. So here's an example. People were asked to count the number of photos in a newspaper. Some people finished in a few seconds, others took minutes. It's not that some were faster counters. The secret lay on page 2 in huge block letters where it said, "Stop counting. There are 43 photographs in the paper." But some people were so focused on just looking for pictures that they didn't notice these words, which gave them the answer. So we need to balance selective attention with cognitive flexibility. There are many ways we can scaffold inhibitory control to help children succeed despite weak inhibitory control. Scaffolds enable children to function at a higher level than they would otherwise be able, and to practice skills they otherwise would not be able to practice. So here's an example, a dad scaffolding his daughter to walk across a log high above a river. Without dad holding on, she wouldn't be able to do it. But with dad supporting her, she's able to do the walking. She's doing it, but dad's scaffolding her to make it possible. So scaffolds enable us to do something without that assistance we wouldn't be able to do on our own or practice on our own. Young children have very immature attentional control. They can easily get distracted by beautiful pictures on the page, on the wall. So kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers love to decorate their rooms with beautiful pictures and posters on the wall, and the rooms look beautiful. But the research has shown that young children have more difficulty paying attention to the lesson when there are all these visual distractions on the wall. They actually learn better and pay more attention when the walls are more bare. It doesn't mean the classroom needs to be unattractive, but it needs to have less visual distraction on the room for the young children. On the other hand, we can underestimate how capable young children can be. Next, you'll see a 3-year-old displaying really outstanding perseverance and focused attention, despite lots of distraction around him. And there's no sound on this video, but I don't think you really need it. Yay. Now, how many of you would have had the patience to wait? We're so tempted to go in there. You know, he's so close so often. You know, he knows what he's trying to do. We're so tempted to go in there and help. But if we helped, he wouldn't have this pride of having done it himself. So we need to remember to be patient. We need to give children time to figure things out on their own and not intervene too early to help out. We adults want to do for children, but less is more. When a child's struggling, our first inclination is to get in there and want to help. But if you solve the problem, you're the strong, heroic one, and the child is the weak, needy one. Have faith in the child's abilities and intellect. We need to empower even the little ones, promote their autonomy, help them to feel that they did it themselves, involve them in decision-making, give them a say, give them an important responsibility. There's a study called the Coca-Cola study because Coca-Cola funded it. It was done, I think, in Atlanta, at least it was someplace in the southeastern US, and it was in an elementary school. There were 5th grade boys in the school who were terrible readers and terrible behavior problems, a serious problem for the school. And the administration went to the boys and they said, I have an important responsibility for you. This is very serious. I want you guys to tutor the 2nd graders who were struggling in reading. The 5th grader, those 5th grade boys couldn't read much better than the 3rd graders, so they couldn't ask them to tutor the 3rd graders, but they read better than the 2nd graders. And the boys took this very seriously. And in short order, all the behavior problems disappeared. And by the end of the year, not only were the 2nd graders reading better, but those 5th grade boys were also reading better. It's important to give kids important responsibilities. Let them know that we have confidence in them. An example of how children can practice and thus improve their inhibitory control is here. So for example, you can have little ones walk on a line on the ground, like outside where the sidewalk has lines between things. For them to walk on a line on the ground is as hard as it is for us to walk on a balance beam or a high wire. It requires serious, focused attention. And then when they get better, you can make it harder. So for example, you can have everybody, even you, follow the leader walking on a line. Everybody holds a bell. And the goal is that nobody should make a sound with their bell. It requires focused attention, and you get immediate feedback when your focus wanders. And there are lots of traditional games that do the same kind of thing, where you have a race with a spoon with an egg or water on the spoon, or you have to walk with somebody on your head. And all of these things, which young children love to do because they love to help out and have responsibilities and feel like they're doing adult chores, all of these require careful, focused attention. A great example of when you need focused attention is singing in a round. That really challenges you not to pay attention to what the others are doing. An example of a task that assesses selective attention is the flanker task. On the flanker test, you have to focus on the center stimulus and ignore the flanking ones, okay? So, for example, this is easy because everything's pointing in the same direction. This is easy because the flankers aren't pointing left or right. They're not pointing in a valid direction on the test. And this is easy because the center one is all by itself. But this is harder when the flankers are facing one way and the one you're supposed to focus on is facing the other way. So I thought maybe you could try it. So if everybody make believe you have a response button for your left and right thumb or your left and right forefinger, whatever you want. Okay, ready? You want to point in the direction that the center stimulus is facing, the direction the center fish is facing. Okay? Okay, that gives you a flavor for what it's like. In our lab, we make it harder. So on the next block, you now need to focus on the flankers and ignore the center stimulus. So that introduces change and inhibitory control, more inhibitory control, because now you have to change where you're focusing. So only focus on the flankers and don't pay attention to the center. Okay, here's a chance to, again, experience it. Just pay attention to the outside fish. Okay, and finally, we mix them together. So when the stimuli are blue, you focus on the center. And when the stimuli are pink, you focus on the outside. Okay, this is much more demanding. Okay? Pink outside, blue inside. Here you go. Yeah, everybody makes mistakes.
I can't remember which is which.
Okay, very good, everybody. Okay, what we found is in the mixed block, the difference in performance on the incongruent trials and the easy trials is much bigger than on the regular flanker task. And I mean, here you can see it's like 10 times bigger. And it's not that the mixed block came later, because here you can see we give block 1 and block 2 again afterwards, and they still show a very small difference in performance on the incongruent versus the congruent trials. You get a bigger flanker effect if you mix the two kinds of trials together. And the effect is also much more robust in the face of variations in how you present the stimuli. So the flanker effect has been studied in dozens of labs all over the world. It's very replicable. Everybody finds it. But it's very small, and it's very sensitive to stimulus parameters. So if the stimuli are too large or if they're too far apart, it goes away. Here you see it just with the small stimuli. And again, you saw the small size I showed you before. But if you do it in the mixed block, now it really doesn't matter. None of these is significantly different from one another. You see it regardless of the stimulus characteristics. So the flanker effect itself is much more robust in the mixed block. And that was the original paper that reported it. Also, you see a much longer developmental progression. So here you see from 4 years to 18 years. If you just look at the flanker effect, it tends to ceiling out around 7 or 8 years of age. And it's more sensitive to treatment effects and probably more sensitive to clinical group differences. So years ago, we looked at a program called Tools of the Mind, which is for preschoolers and kindergartners. And one of the outcome measures was the flanker test. In this case, what we did was when it was pink, you focus on the center stimulus, and when it's blue, you focus on the outside. But it doesn't matter. It's still a flanker test. And what we found is on the reverse flanker, the block 2, you get a big difference between the kids in Tools of the Mind and the kids in the other new curriculum, the one that the district developed. Tools of the Mind kids were up at 85% correct. The other kids were a chance. If you look at the flanker block, the standard classic flanker test, the difference was significant, but it was really small. You couldn't see it with the naked eye. You needed statistics. But the difference on the reverse flanker trials was obvious to anyone. You didn't even need statistics to see it. Okay, and that was reported in Science. Okay, inhibitory control at the level of behavior is self-control. Self-control involves resisting temptations, not acting impulsively, thinking before you act. And if you're a little kid, a huge part of your life every day involves demands on inhibitory control. I mean, just think about it. Wait your turn, raise your hand, don't grab another child's toys, don't eat sweets before dinner, don't pee in your pants. There are all of these don'ts, right? And even for us at any age, if somebody hurts your feelings, your natural inclination might be to hurt back, but you use self-control not to get in the cycle of tit for tat and not to immediately say something hurtful. You wait before you blurt out the first thing that comes to mind. An example I often give is maybe there's an old friend, a dear friend, somebody you're really looking forward to seeing, who you haven't seen in years. But your first reaction on seeing your old friend is, my God, how much weight you gained. But you don't say that. You say something to make your friend feel good, right? To resist acting in the heat of the moment. Maybe you dash off a really angry email message, but you don't press send right away. You use some self-control. Or to resist jumping to the conclusion of what something must have meant or why somebody did something, because we can often be wrong. And if we wait to get more information, then we'll see that often. And discipline and perseverance, resisting all the temptations to quit and not finish what you started. To stay on task despite being bored, despite initial failures and setbacks, despite all the other more fun things you might be doing. Self-control saves us from putting our foot in our mouth or making a social faux pas. Think of all the trouble you'd get in if you told your boss what you really thought of him or her. If you grabbed whatever you wanted without asking or paying, or did other socially inappropriate or hurtful things. If you want to change, if you want to mend your ways, you need self-control. Without inhibitory control, we'd be at the mercy of impulses, old habits of thought or action, and stimuli in the environment that pull us this way or that. Inhibition allows us a measure of control over our attention and our actions. It makes it possible for us to change and to choose how we react, rather than being unthinking creatures of habit. It doesn't make it easy, but it makes it possible. An example of a task that assesses response inhibition, this one for babies, is a task I called the object retrieval task. So here you have a 6-month-old. She sees her pacifier inside a transparent box. The box has no bottom and it's open at the front. So the only way to get her pacifier is to reach through the front, but she doesn't see the pacifier through the front side. She sees it through the top. So the only place she's reaching is the top. And it's not like she gives up right away. She keeps trying and she keeps trying and she keeps trying. But the only strategy a 6-month-old has is to reach where he or she is looking. They're not able to inhibit that. They're not able to do anything else. They just reach where they're looking. And so they fail when they're looking through the top and the front is open. Now, so finally she gives up. So now notice where the box is vis-a-vis the edge of the table and where the pacifier is in the box, because that's going to change now. So I've moved the box back and the pacifier forward. So now she can see in the front. And now she gets it because she reaches wherever she's looking through. But you go back to the original condition and she doesn't learn from that. They cannot inhibit reaching where they're looking. That's all a 6-month-old can do. They cannot exercise the inhibition to succeed at this task when it involves reaching one place and looking another. And this is just so that when you look at it on your own later, it tells you what I just said. And here you can see at ages 7.5, 8 months, 6 months, all of these young babies only get it when they're looking through the side the side that's open. If they're looking through a closed side, they fail. Even if they've looked through and now no longer look through, they usually fail. But by 11 months, now he can look in the opening and sit up and reach in, no problem. He's looking through the top now, but he's reaching in the side. And by 12 months, he doesn't even need to lean over and look in the opening. He can just touch both sides, and whichever side is open, he reaches in and gets it. It couldn't be easier. So you can see at 12 months, it takes them typically less than five seconds to succeed. But you look at the younger babies, and they're not even succeeding at 30 seconds often. And you could also see that at every age, it's easier with an opaque box. They're faster with an opaque box than they are with a transparent one. That's because when the box is opaque, they don't have to inhibit that pull to reach through the side they're looking because they can't look through the closed side. So even though they have less information when it's opaque, they have much more visual information when it's transparent. When it's opaque, they do better because they don't have to inhibit the misleading visual information they're getting by looking through a clear side. And that's the developmental progression. As I go through the talk, I'll talk about a couple of the phases they go through. And the darker histograms are the babies I followed longitudinally. The open ones are babies I tested only once. So you can see that babies who are novel to the task often do a little bit worse than those who've had repeated experience every 2 weeks from when they were 6 months. But the same developmental progression basically holds, whether you're testing babies who are naive to the task or babies who have done it repeatedly. Just because prefrontal cortex isn't fully functional when you're young doesn't mean it isn't functional at all and that it can't be improved with practice. And the analogy I give is a 2-year-old's legs. A 2-year-old's legs are immature, just like prefrontal cortex is immature in a baby. But with those legs, a 2-year-old can walk, a 2-year-old can even run, which is to say that even with an immature prefrontal cortex, it can subserve executive functions to some extent. Not at the full adult extent, just like the 2-year-old can't run as well as he's going to be able to run 10 years later, but to some extent. And with practice and training, it can do it better. Okay, here's a test of inhibitory control for children who are slightly older, like 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. Which one is bigger? Now, this is easy, right? Because the object, the animal that's objectively bigger is appearing bigger in size here, just like the mom is bigger than the baby. This is easy. Okay, then you have the objects drawn in the opposite to what their real size is, but you have to say which object in reality is larger, not which is depicted larger, but which is really larger. So you look at this and you have to say elephant, okay? You look at this and you have to say mommy. You look at this and you have to say tree. And then you can give it intermixed. So here it's easy, here it's hard, here it's easy, here it's hard again. Inhibition is far more difficult for young children than we often appreciate. And to show you that, I'm going to have you do another test. This one is called hearts and flowers. When you see a heart, you press on the same side. And when you see a flower, you press on the opposite side. Okay, here you can see a 4-year-old doing it. And before we do that, we give the children practice with the buttons. And this gives you another measure. It gives you choice reaction time. So they get used to pressing on one side, pressing on the other side, and then you give them practice with the hearts and with the flowers. Okay, so now you're going to do hearts. Imagine you have a response button for each hand. Okay, it's important that you try this so you can see what the mixed block is like. Otherwise, just telling you, you don't get the sense the same way. So you're going to press on the same side as the heart. Fantastic. Okay, now you're going to get the incongruent block, only flowers. Press on the side opposite the flower. Okay, flower opposite. Very good. Okay, now you're going to get them intermixed, but the rules are the same. Heart, same side, flower, opposite. It's not that children forget the rules any more than you forgot them if you made a mistake or two on the mixed block. You remembered the rules. It's just that your hands aren't substantiating it fast enough. In fact, if I gave you lots of trials for the heart block and lots of trials for the flower block, you would generally be as fast and as accurate on the block of only flowers and the block of only hearts. Those are pretty easy for us. But the mixed block is harder. We adults are slower and we make more mistakes. Typically, every adult will make at least 1 or 2 mistakes on the mixed block. The same thing in children. The mixed block is disproportionately harder than either the flower block or the heart block. Now that is looking at cognitive flexibility, which I'll come to later. That's looking at switching, and that's what's most difficult. So here was an earlier version of the test where instead of hearts and flowers, we had gray discs and black and white striped discs. And what you see is you get activation of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex when you get those, and you get that even in young children. But the reason I included this here when I'm talking about self-control is because of an effect you find in children that's absent in adults. And that is, I told you that we're as accurate and as fast on the flowers as we are on the hearts, but that's not true of children. Across every age we studied, which was 4 years to 13 years, children make more mistakes and they're slower on the block of flowers than the block of hearts. Now, what's the difference between the block of flowers and the block of hearts? Each has only one rule. One rule is press on the same side. The other rule is press on the opposite side. So the working memory demands are the same. The difference is only in the inhibitory demands. For the heart block, you do what comes naturally. You press on the same side. For the flower block, you have to inhibit that and do the opposite. So what you see here is an effect of inhibitory demand alone that's present in children and absent in adults. And this says what I just said, so if you're looking at it on your own, you can remember. And it doesn't matter whether the heart block comes first or the flower block comes first. You see the same thing. Now, but even very young children have great memories. If you've ever played the game of concentration with a 5-year-old, the 5-year-old will often beat you. They have great memories. So we do a condition where the stimuli are in the center. So now neither hand is preferentially activated, and you need to learn to press on the right for one of these and press on the left for the other. And we practice those. And then after you've practiced those, we add 4 more. So now you have 6 stupid, arbitrary rules. For one abstract shape, you press on the right, and for the other abstract shape, you press on the left. This is completely arbitrary. What you find is that in children 4 to 9 years of age, the difference in their performance on hearts versus flowers is bigger than the difference in their performance for 2 rules versus 6. So the inhibitory demand takes a bigger role, has a bigger effect on their performance than the difference in memory demands. And the opposite is true for us adults. We are much worse at trying to remember 6 rules versus 2. And we're no worse at doing flowers than we are at hearts. So this says what I just said again. We adults may not appreciate how inordinately difficult inhibition is for little kids because it's so much less difficult for us. Young children are often capable of responding correctly if some way can be found to cause them to delay just for a few moments before they respond. So we developed another Stroop-like test for children called the day-night test. Here, when you see a white card with a sun, you're supposed to say night. And when you see a black card with a moon and stars, you're supposed to say day. We practice with the children. They start out performing correctly, but they often don't continue to perform correctly over the 16 trials. But I noticed that whenever they took their time, they seemed to perform well. So I said, no problem, we can get everybody to succeed. All we have to do is have them take their time. But you ask a 3 or 4-year-old to wait, you might as well save your breath. It has no effect whatsoever. So we had to come up with a way to get them to wait. And the way we came up with was singing a little ditty to them after they see the card. Now you might think that jabbering at them when they're trying to compute the answer would get in the way. But no, there are a chance if you don't do this ditty, and they're up about 90% correct with the ditty. If you do the ditty before they see the card, it doesn't help. But if you show the card and you sing the ditty and then they can respond, it does help. And I wanted to show you what this looks like. You can imagine that the people in my lab are very embarrassed to do this and they don't want anybody to see them. So not to embarrass anybody else, you'll see me, unfortunately. Normally, one child will get one condition or the other, but for a film crew, we had the same child do both. You'll see that the child remembers the rules. He never forgets what he's supposed to do. But he's so impulsive, he'll often say the wrong thing, but then he immediately self-corrects. So he's showing you that he knows. And he's so impulsive that occasionally he answers before he even sees the card. In this game, when you see this white card with a sun, you're supposed to say night. Can you say night? Good. And when you see this black card with the moon, you're supposed to say day. Yes. So what do you say when you see this? Night. Yes. And what do you say when you see this? Morning. Night. Morning. Night. Morning. Night. Morning. Night. Night. Morning. Night. Morning. Yes! Can we try it once more? This time, I'm going to sing a little ditty after I show you the card. And I don't want you to answer till after I'm finished singing, okay? Can we try that? Okay. So, think about the answer. Don't tell me. Now can you tell me? What do you say? Morning. Think about the answer. Don't tell me. Now what do you say? Night. Think about the answer. Don't tell me. Now. Night. Think about the answer. Don't tell me. Now. Morning. Think about the answer. Don't tell me. Now. Morning. Having children delay responding scaffolds their emerging inhibitory control ability, because by the time they're able to respond, the impulsive response, which rushed to be made right away, now has started to subside. And the response that takes time to compute is now coming up to the response threshold. So you're just helping their inhibitory control ability by giving their impulsive response time to subside before they can respond. The PATHS program, which is an early social emotional program for young elementary school children, takes advantage of this. So they say whenever you get really upset, don't hit the other child. Instead, do turtle. And doing turtle involves hugging yourself in this tight turtle position, getting into your shell, just like a turtle would, putting your head down, taking a deep breath. And this is brilliant because it doesn't say, if you get really upset, instead of hitting the child, wait, because wait wouldn't do any good. It gives the child something else to do instead of hitting the other child. And it so happens that the other things it gives the child to do are things that naturally calm you down, like holding yourself tightly or taking a deep breath. So I just wanted to highlight that for you. Many of the tasks we see children of 3 to 5 years of age improve on are ones that require inhibitory control. And there's a whole series of tests that you see changes in between 3 to 5 years of age. So for example, there are appearance reality tests. On these kind of tests, you may be shown something like this, and you ask the child, what does it look like? And the child says a rock, which is absolutely the right answer. And then you show the child that you can squeeze it. So even though it looked like a rock, it really is a sponge. So now the child is supposed to wrap his or her head around the fact that it looks like one thing, but really is something else. 3-year-olds will have no part of that. It either looks like a sponge and it really is a sponge, or it looks like a rock and it really is a rock. But it has to make up its mind. It can't be both. Okay? It can't inhibit one in order to be able to say the other thing. We adults pass these tasks, but a discomfort with ambiguity and difficulty in seeing both sides of an issue or different perspectives on the same thing remains even in us, right? Even adults have difficulty accepting that good people or good nations sometimes act wrongly, or that people we disagree with might be right about something. You see this especially in the US these days. There's a type of false belief test called theory of mind test. Many of you are probably familiar with this. So a puppet hides a favorite toy in one container, and then the puppet leaves. And when the puppet's away out and can't see what's happening, we move that favorite reward to a different container. And then you ask the child, where is the puppet going to look? Is the puppet going to look where he put it, or in the new place where it really is? And again, this requires inhibitory control, because the child wants to show how smart he or she is. They followed everything that's happened. They know where it really is. And you experiment and want the child to give the wrong answer. You want to say where it had been before, because that's what the puppet who left is supposed to say. And children have a terribly hard time inhibiting saying the correct answer in order to say that wrong answer. Adults, too, show a tendency to attribute what we know to someone less knowledgeable. We have difficulty inhibiting or ignoring what we know when making assessments about what somebody who doesn't know that would do. And this is some of the studies that show that. It's called the curse of knowledge, or the curse of expertise. Then there are other kinds of false belief tasks that are not theory of mind tasks. And these require holding in mind a true belief about something and a false belief about that same thing. So, for example, you show children the Skittles box, and you ask them, what do you think is in the box? Well, they may be 3, but they're not stupid. They say Skittles, which is absolutely the right answer, right? Then you show them that in this particular box, there happen to be crayons. Okay? So then you ask the child, what had you thought was in the box before I showed you? And with an absolutely straight face, 3-year-olds say crayons, of course. Anybody would have said crayons. They can't hold in mind those two things. They want to give the right answer. Now, we adults don't claim that we thought there were crayons in the box before. But what we do is we rate as more likely that outcome. So if I asked you before, what's the likelihood that crayons are going to be in a Skittles box? You would say like maybe 5% likelihood. It's very unlikely. Then I show you that there really are crayons in the Skittles box. A week later, I have you come back and I say, remember when you were in the lab before and I asked you to guess the likelihood that there would be crayons in the Skittles box? What did you guess? And you say, I guessed, well, maybe 15%. You increase the likelihood. You still say it's unlikely, but you increase the likelihood because you're affected by what you saw later. And that's called knew it all along, or hindsight bias. And we have lots of examples of this in a paper. Inhibitory control is the executive function that's most predictive of long-term outcomes. Children with better inhibitory control, that is, children who were more persistent, less impulsive, and had better attention regulation when they were little kids, later as teenagers, are less likely to make risky choices, have unplanned pregnancies, or drop out of school. And as adults 30 years later, they have better health, higher incomes and better jobs, fewer run-ins with the law, and they report that they have a higher quality of life than their peers who, as little kids, had worse inhibitory control. And that's true controlling for almost every variable under the sun. It's based on a study of 1,000 children born in the same year, in the same city, for 32 years, followed with a 96% retention rate. A study of 500 fraternal twin pairs found that the twin with worse inhibitory control at age 5 was more likely than his or her sibling, now at 12 years of age, to smoke, perform poorly in school, or engage in antisocial behavior, even though each twin pair grew up together in the same home. Okay, if it's not yet 3, I have time to take some questions now. Good, okay.
Yeah, so calling back to some of the programs that you had mentioned, the Tools of the Mind and the PATHS program, how were those developed, or are they still available even?
Yes, both Tools of the Mind and PATHS are still available. PATHS was developed by a woman whose last name is Domavich or something like that, and Mark Greenberg. And it's widely used in many countries. It was developed in the US, but it's used in many countries throughout the world. And you can just Google it. Tools of the Mind is used in about 35 states in the US. Washington, D.C. uses it district-wide, so every school, public school in Washington, D.C. uses it. It's only for preschool and kindergarten. It doesn't go past kindergarten. It was developed by Debbie Liang and Elena Botrova, both Americans. Elena is from Russia, and it's based on the work of Vygotsky and Luria. Both programs are still available. PATHS has been more codified, so it's easier to get it from a manual. Tools requires specific training by the developers or their staff to be able to do tools. There are a few schools in Vancouver who have been using tools, and we've documented that the children in Vancouver do much better in tools than in the standard BC curriculum. They show better executive functions. There's less bullying, there's less cliques, there's less teacher burnout, etc. The benefits have been really large in the Vancouver and Surrey schools that have used tools. Sorry.
What are the key differences between the curriculum and the standard curriculum?
Tools of the Mind is a whole curriculum. So what they initially tried was to embed Tools of the Mind in existing curriculum. So like from 10 to 11 in the morning, you do Tools of the Mind. And what they found is if you did that, children improved on what they practiced in tools, but it didn't generalize. You didn't have widespread benefits. In order to see the widespread benefits, the practice and executive functions need to be part and parcel of what the children did all day long. It had to be part of reading. It had to be part of math. It had to be part of everything. So tools now is a comprehensive curriculum. PATHS is an add-on. It's not a comprehensive curriculum. And it only focuses on socio-emotional skills and self-control. But they encourage teachers to incorporate what they've learned in PATHS in the curriculum in general. But that's really at the teacher's discretion. Tools is kind of an add-on. It's a little bit easier. It takes less training to do PATHS, but tools seems to have greater benefits, more widespread benefits. But again, it's just for the early years, whereas PATHS goes at least through 4th grade, if not older.
And then I think we'll have a couple of questions.
They're coming in from online, which is great. So are there other programs for older school age kids as well to practice inhibitory control?
There are lots of curricula that say that they benefit executive functions. There's not a lot of evidence. PATHS and tools have evidence that they improve executive functions. There's some evidence that Montessori improves executive functions, and Montessori goes from infancy even to grade 12. But aside from Montessori, there's the Chicago School Readiness Program, but again, that's for Head Start. That's for young children. Most of the programs are for young children that have evidence. Mind Up. That's from Goldie Hawn's Foundation. Many teachers in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia are using it. The teachers really like it. And Kim Schonert-Reichel did a study that I was a co-author on, where we found better executive functions. We found less bullying, less cliques, better math, fewer school absences with Mind Up. And that study was done in 4th graders. I don't know of any programs for junior high or high school other than Montessori.
Okay, and then I guess even as you go forward, folks are always interested in what parents can do at home to help foster inhibitory control and executive functioning as well. And another question asking about the high scope curriculum, if you're familiar with that.
Yes. So people may be familiar with Jim Heckman's long-term study of high scope that showed that kids did better in adulthood 30, 40 years later if they'd been in high scope. There weren't executive function measures. There weren't academic measures in high scope. It was all after people had left school and were adults. So there's good reason to think high scope would be beneficial, but there aren't the studies. So high scope, Reggio Emilia looked like they could be beneficial. There just aren't studies. In terms of what parents can do, the way to improve executive functions is to continually practice them. A man named Erickson spent his career looking at what makes an expert in any field. And the answer was always the same, gazillions of hours of practice. He said 10,000 hours of practice. So if you want to get good at anything, you need to keep practicing. And it's not just practicing, but it's constantly pushing yourself to improve. So if you keep practicing what's easy, you don't really improve. You want to keep pushing yourself. So if you always run a quarter mile, your running doesn't improve that much. But if you start at a quarter mile and you work up to half a mile and a mile and 2 miles and you keep pushing yourself, then you get better. So it's the same thing with executive function. You need to keep practicing, but you need to keep pushing yourself. And so anything that parents do at home that it requires inhibitory control, where the child keeps practicing and where the child keeps getting challenged. So it could be activities like I mentioned, like walking on a line on the ground, and then maybe walking on a log in the woods, etc., or walking with something on your head, or walking with the bell. There are lots of activities that intrinsically require inhibitory control that children enjoy, like martial arts, for example. So if the child enjoys it, then the child's going to spend a lot of time doing it and maybe be motivated to keep pushing him or herself to improve. So any activity that requires inhibitory control that the child's willing to spend time and effort in should improve them. Okay?
Let's carry on for now. And then we'll come back.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next core executive function is working memory, holding information in mind and working or playing with it. And that's critical for anything that unfolds over time, because that always requires holding in mind what came before and relating that to what's happening now. So that's obvious for oral language, right? Because you're not hearing what I said earlier. So you have to hold in mind what I said earlier and relate that to what I'm saying now. But it's also true for reading. You can't hold in mind all the words on the page or all the words in the book. You have to hold in mind what you read earlier and relate that to what you're reading now. It's critical for mental math, for understanding cause and effect. Let's say you do something and you get a reaction from somebody. If you don't remember what you did, you don't understand why you're getting that reaction. What did I do? Why are you acting like that? What's going on here? You know, I'm blameless. I didn't do anything. So you need it for lots of things. For reasoning and problem solving, right? In order to hold ideas and facts in your mind and relate them to one another. See how they relate. Maybe take them apart and see how they relate a different way. Working memory and inhibitory control each independently predict both math and reading competence from the earliest grades through university, and often better than does IQ or even socioeconomic status sometimes. An example of how to scaffold children with poor working memory is an example from Tools of the Mind here. They'll ask all the 4 or 5-year-olds in the room to each get a picture book, now get in a pair with another child, and take turns telling the story that goes with the pictures in your book. Well, all the children are all excited to tell their story, and nobody wants to be the listener. And again, it's worthless to say you wait or you just don't talk now. They don't listen. So what teachers do in Tools is they give one child in each pair just a simple drawing of an ear. And they explain that ears don't talk, ears listen. And with that concrete reminder, the children are able to listen. Without it, they wouldn't be able to. And after a few months, they don't need that anymore because they've internalized it. So simple little visual aids can help scaffold working memory when that's an issue. For example, it's recently been found that many of the instances of incontinence in old age homes and care facilities is not because of any biological problem. It's because the residents have forgotten where the restroom is and they're too embarrassed to ask. So if you simply put up visual reminders of how to find the restroom, then you get rid of most of the instances of incontinence in old age homes and nursing facilities. Executive functions need to be continually challenged to see improvements, not just used, but challenged. Storytelling is a terrific way to challenge and improve working memory and also sustained attention, both telling stories and listening to them. And I'm a huge fan of storytelling. Storytelling requires and invites your rapt attention for extended periods, sustained, focused attention, and working memory to hold in mind everything that's happened so far, the different characters' identities, what's happened in the story, all of this without visual aids, without the pictures on the page or puppets acting it out or video. You have to hold it all in mind. A researcher randomly assigned children in kindergarten and grade 1 to storytelling, where the teacher saw the pages in the book but didn't turn them around to show the children. So the teacher was like she was telling the story. Or story reading, where after the teacher read each page, she turned the page around so the children could see the pictures in the book. And what the researcher found is vocabulary and recall improved more in the children in storytelling than in the children in story reading. The more interaction, the more conversation between the story reader and teller and the children, the more actively engaged the children are, the more their vocabulary improves. Questions interspersed during a story help most, but just commenting during the sharing of a story helps more than just conveying the story itself. The conversation that takes place in the context of reading or storytelling seems to have more benefit than the storytelling or reading itself. And there's a recent study that came out in February in Psychological Science, which showed that the conversation is what drives the development of Broca's area, which is important for language. So what they looked at was how many words, etc. They looked at all kinds of variables. And more important than the quantity of conversation, the number of words, the variety of words, was the turn taking between the adults and the children. The more turn taking there was, the more Broca's area developed earlier, the more development you could see in Broca's area. And I think this adds to the list of beneficial outcomes that come from responsive parenting, to listening to and responding to your child. It's not just talking to your child, but responding to what your child says to you. Maybe one reason for that researcher's findings that storytelling was more beneficial than story reading is that when you're reading to a child, you need to look down at the page at least some of the time to see what you're reading. And that breaks the eye contact. It breaks the interaction. But if you're just telling the story, then you're maintaining that eye contact and you're inviting the child to be part of the interaction. You're inviting the child to speak to you and have an interaction with you, as opposed to just being a passive listener. While story reading is wonderful, I encourage it. I predict that storytelling should improve attention and working memory more because it challenges them more. You may think that children need basic literacy skills to be ready for school. They don't. Children need oral language skills, basic language skills, in order to be ready for school. Oral language is the foundation of early literacy. Children need to be exposed to a lot of rich oral language. Vocabulary assessed at age 3 strongly predicts reading comprehension at 9 to 10 years of age. Over the course of evolutions, our brains became adapted to acquire language. We are biologically predisposed to acquire oral language, but we're not biologically predisposed to acquire reading or writing. They're too new. Those are just cultural acquisitions. And some children, because it's not biologically built in, are not yet ready to learn to read at 4 or 5 or even 6 years of age. It doesn't mean they won't be great readers later. It just means that they're not yet ready to learn to read early. And we don't want children to think that they're failures. We don't want them to think, oh my God, I can't read and I'm 5 years old. I'm never going to be able to do this stuff in school. We want them to love learning and enjoy school and feel that they can learn. It's more important that children don't think that they're dumb and can't succeed or come to hate school than it is for them to start reading at an early age. The country of Finland doesn't have children start school till they're 7 years of age. So they don't learn to read till they're 7 in Finland. By the time they're in 4th grade, the kids in Finland score better on the standardized test than kids anywhere else in the world. So there's no evidence that starting to learn to read a little later is any harm. And you know, the kid who starts to walk at age 15 months, by age 3 is going to be just as good a walker and runner as the kid who started to walk at 9 months of age, right? Just like beginning to talk. Some kids learn to talk earlier, but a few years later, you can't tell who talked early and who talked later. It's the same thing with reading. But you can get kids to feel terrible if you insist that at an early age they have to be reading. And the way we feel about ourselves has a huge effect on how we actually perform. So if you've made a little kid begin to think and expect that he's not going to be able to do well in school, now that's going to have a huge effect on how that kid actually does do in school. There are lots of examples of this, but one really stark example comes from a field of social psychology called stereotype threat. There are lots of stereotypes in our culture. One stereotype is that in general, men are better at math than women. And sure enough, a group of researchers went to a university, gave a standardized math test, and no surprise, the men did better than the women as a group. Then they gave exactly the same math test to an exactly comparable group of university students. The only thing they changed was before they handed out the test, they said this particular test has been designed to be gender neutral. On this particular test, women perform as well as men. And what did they find? The women performed as well as the men. It was the same test. The only difference was that the women expected that they'd be able to do well. So we want kids to continue to expect themselves to be able to succeed. Children need to believe in themselves. Avoid children having failure experiences. Hold off on requiring that 4, 5, or 6-year-olds be able to read. It doesn't mean to hold somebody back. If the child can read at 4, that's fine, but don't require it for the ones who can't yet. I predict that children drilled in reading in kindergarten will test better on reading at the end of kindergarten than the kids who aren't taught to read yet, right? The kids who only get oral language aren't going to be able to read as well at the end of kindergarten. But I predict at the end of 2nd grade, those steeped in oral language in kindergarten are going to be the better readers. A fun game for practicing working memory is you can have cards or use the computer, it doesn't matter. And you have a card with one geometric shape, like a circle. And you pick a movement that you have to do to it. So let's say you put your hands up. Then for another geometric shape, you have a different movement, like putting your palms out. And then for a third geometric shape, there's yet a third one. So you practice. For a circle, you do this. For a square, you do this. For triangle, you do that. And then you give them a series of these things and you show the cards. So now they have to remember what they're supposed to do for each of the cards. And then you can add inhibitory control and cognitive flexibility demands by changing the mappings. So maybe now for circle, you cross your hands in front of you, okay? And for square, you do something else. So now you have to inhibit the early mappings and remember the new mappings. An example of how to scaffold children with fragile working memory I just gave you, so that repeats it. An example of a test that assesses working memory for babies is the A not B test that Piaget developed years ago. So you hold up something that the baby, or in this case also a monkey, wants very much, and there are two hiding places. And the baby watches you hide it in one of two places. You make sure they've seen where it's hidden, because of course it's not fair if they didn't see where it goes. And then there's a very brief delay. The two places are covered with identical covers. You make sure that the child or the monkey doesn't cheat by continuing to look at the correct place. And then after 2 seconds or 5 seconds, they're allowed to reach. And by 7 months of age, 7.5 months, babies can do this with a brief delay of like a second or two. And mothers are so excited. I have a genius. I'm going to go home and tell the grandparents, this is fantastic. And then after a couple of times of repeating this, you do the same thing, but now you change where the toy is hidden. Now you're going to hide it in the other hiding place. Okay, the procedure is the same. You cover them both simultaneously, make sure they see. You cover them both simultaneously with identical covers, same length of delay, same everything. And now the baby reaches back to the first place. And the mother is mortified. A moment ago, she had a genius. What happened here? And you have to assure her the babies all over the world do this. This is perfectly normal. It's called the A not B error. And what you can see with age is that as babies get older and older, you need longer and longer delays. These are seconds before you see the A not B error. So but at 8 months, you see it with like 3 seconds. But by 9.5 months, you need over 5 seconds before you see the delay. So babies can withstand longer and longer delay periods as they get older. Their memory is improving. But many tests don't require just one ability. Like I showed you with object retrieval. There's an inhibitory component, but there are other components. And here you're going to see with A not B that there's also other components. So memory is a huge aspect, but there's also inhibitory control. So this is the B trial. This is first the baby saw it hidden here, and now the baby's watching it being hidden here. And there's a brief delay, and now the parent is about to release the child's hands. This is the very beginning of the reach. And watch the baby's eyes and watch the baby's hands over the next few slides. Okay, if you were using where he's looking, you'd say the baby's right. But the baby can't inhibit that old rewarded response to reach back. So it requires both memory and inhibition, not just memory. An object retrieval that I showed you requires inhibition. Also you can see a memory component. So here's a 9-month-old. So she's bending down to look in the front. But now she can sit up, look through that closed top, and reach through the opening. The memory of having looked in the opening is enough. And she succeeds. If she doesn't look in the opening, she doesn't succeed. But if she looks in the opening but doesn't continue to, she succeeds almost as much as if she's looking through the opening. So if she only looks through the top, if she only looks through the top, she doesn't succeed if the front is open. But if she looks in the front, but now sits up and looks through the top, she can succeed because she has the memory to remember to look along where she's going to have to reach. And of course, if she's looking through the front, she always succeeds. Working memory and just holding information in mind, short-term memory, are different. They're not the same thing. So forward digit span assesses short-term memory, not working memory. So after you see each number here, tell me back all the numbers in the order in which you've seen them, okay? I'm going to show you a few numbers. After you've seen all of them, tell me all of them in the order in which you saw them. Okay, can you say them back in the order in which they appeared? Excellent. Very good, guys. Okay. Now, backward digit span. This requires working memory. Say them back in the opposite order to how you saw them. Okay, so if you see 6, 2, you're going to say 2, 6 in response, okay? You're going to see a series. Okay, can you say them back in the opposite order? Excellent. Very good, everybody. Excellent. Okay, now this is even harder. You're going to need to reorder the numbers in numerical order from smallest to larger. So if I show you 6, 2, 9, you're going to say 2, 6, 9. Okay, not backwards, not forwards, but in the order, numerical order. Okay, here you go. Okay, can anyone do that? Outstanding, great. Okay, that's great. Okay, now even if you made a mistake, I don't care. Okay, very young children aren't facile with numbers. Even backward digit span is too hard for them. So you need to use images. So for example, I'm going to show you a few images and tell me them back in order of size. Okay? Okay, can you say those back in order of size? Snail, fish, dolphin. Okay? And here's just a longer list. Okay, you ready? This is challenging. Let's see if you can do it. Okay, can anybody do that? Almost. Yes, horse. Yes. Okay, so you get the idea. Here's a spatial task that also assesses working memory. So you're going to see a few cells shaded, then you're going to see a mask, which is a diagonal line of shaded squares, and then you need to point to where those shaded squares had been before you saw the diagonal. Okay? So here's what it looks like. So you need to remember where these two are, then there's the mask, and then you would point to where those two are. Okay, here's another one. You need to remember where those 4 are, then you see the mask, and then you point to where those 4 are. As long as the masking stimulus is used, then Randy Engel and Michael Caine would say it taxes working memory, because you have to hold a representation in mind in the face of interference, in the face of that mask. But many spatial so-called working memory tests don't include a mask, like Corsi blocks. If it doesn't include a mask, then it's a short-term memory task, like forward digit span. It's just in the spatial domain. Okay, if it's not yet 3:25, I have time for questions. Yes?
So you were saying that if children are beginning to read later, then that's not indicative of performance later on in their childhood. But is there any, is early reading an indication of anything?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
It's like early walking. You might be physically gifted, but probably it's just a normal developmental difference. If you're not reading by age 7, then you need to, if you can't learn to read at age 7, then you need to think about going to a language specialist, a reading specialist, and seeing what's going on. So it's not waiting infinitely long, but it's perfectly normal for a 5 or 6-year-old not to be able to read without anything being wrong with the child.
And it doesn't mean anything if they read at 3. Instead.
No, they might be geniuses, but it's just as likely that they're not geniuses.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, and so this makes us sort of think about kids with sensory issues or autism spectrum disorder. So can you speak a little bit about how that might relate to these tasks, or beyond that, are there other programs or strategies to help these children be less impulsive and to manage behaviors that might be explosive in reaction to not being able to achieve tasks, or so on?
Well, autism is a little bit beyond my specialty. kids with autism are very good at hyper-focusing, so they can be extremely good at selective attention. In fact, there's some studies where if you have to find like where's Waldo in a visual display, that people with autism will outperform typically developing people because they're so good at finding the individual element. They tend to be a little less good at gestalts where you have to relate them. I'm trying to think of advice in terms of impulsive outbursts. They're a little bit less likely when there's less pressure to achieve and do well. When children understand it's perfectly normal to make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes, even you and I make mistakes, even Einstein made mistakes, then they're a little bit less likely to get so upset. Also, a lot of times when children have self-regulation issues, the other children in the class can be allies. They can help that child to regulate. They can reassure the child, you know, it's okay, I made a mistake on this too, or, you know, remember we're supposed to do this, or remember you're not supposed to do that. So often the other children in the class, rather than making fun of the child or making the child feel bad, can actually be allies in helping one another to self-regulate. And again, that's a little bit beyond what I do, so I don't have the best answer to that. I apologize.
Oh,
Okay, going back to your point about storytelling versus story reading. So the first thing that comes to my mind is the use of technology, and I want to say this is the least judgmental approach, but you know, some parents do rely on devices such as tablets or televisions for their young children, and that's okay. But in terms of what you were saying about that serve and return interaction, is there like a way we could optimize that, or any evidence or information on that would be really helpful?
We evolved as social creatures. We're fundamentally social. And to the extent that technology minimizes children's experience with that, it's probably not good. But technology as an adjunct can be fine. And there's some things on technology that can be more beneficial than other things. And even things that you think might be beneficial, you need to also recognize the downsides. So like Sesame Street is supposed to be educational, it's meant to be educational, but it assumes a short attention span. It assumes you can't pay attention for more than about 10 seconds, and so it keeps grabbing your attention. So you don't learn to be able to sustain focus with Sesame Street. You're not challenged to get better attentional control. Pat Kuhl's lab did a study years ago where they looked at young children learning a second language. This was, I think, 2 or 3-year-olds. And in one condition, they had the adult speaker sit in front of the child on the floor. In another condition, they showed a video of that adult doing exactly the same thing. In a third condition, they played the audio tape of the adult saying the same thing. And what they found is that young children acquired the second language much better in the real interaction situation, even though in the video they saw the same thing. So even though you would think that just watching something online or watching something on your tablet would be equivalent to seeing the same thing in the real world, at least this study suggests that it's not the same thing, at least for young children. There was something else I was going to say. So there's no study looking at listening to audiobooks, for example, or listening to storytelling on tape. So I don't know if that's as beneficial as the human interaction. But we recently did a review of all the approaches to improving executive function. And computerized cognitive training like CogMed, Luminosity, etc., improves what you train on, but it doesn't generalize to anything beyond exactly what you trained on. and the benefits don't tend to last more than 6 months or a year. But there are a few studies that have not used technology. Instead, they use human interaction. So the person holds up cards, or the person plays tapes to you and talks to you. And those show better benefits. Now, there are many fewer studies of that. So I don't know if that'll hold up, but it suggests that there's something about the social interaction. In fact, one study from the Netherlands found that the benefits from CogMed don't seem to come from the computerized games that developers are so proud of, but the mentoring component that people who use CogMed are required to provide. If you get licensed to do CogMed, you have to get trained in being able to mentor the children doing it. And this study suggests that it's the mentoring component that's driving the benefits rather than the computer program. I should also mention that although there's lots of stuff in the media about the benefits of aerobic exercise for executive functions, aerobic exercise is good for all kinds of reasons, but it does not improve your executive function or your memory. People have then tried to incorporate motor skills, coordinated motor movements, or activities from sports like dribbling a basketball together with the aerobics to make them more cognitively demanding, to see if that would improve executive function. And those results aren't really any better. I think that may be because you're doing even the motor skills in a decontextualized, abstract way. You're not playing basketball. You're doing basketball dribbling just in order to exercise. And I think the benefits might come more from actually playing the game of basketball or playing tennis or whatever. There's one study this is from Japan, that looked at kids learning tennis the way I learned tennis. So first you practice your forehand forever, and then you practice your backhand forever. So you're practicing individual skills decontextualized. And the other condition was having kids from the beginning play age-appropriate tennis. So they're learning tennis by playing tennis. And what they found is the kids improve faster on tennis if they play tennis than if they practice the individual skills, and their executive functions improve more. So it's just one study, and it's not a perfect study, but it suggests that we tend to learn something when we need it for a real-world activity we want to do. And we're less likely to benefit if it's decontextualized, abstract. Does it really have any relation to something we want to do? So you want to learn to be able to dribble in order to be able to score in the game. You don't particularly want to learn to dribble just for the sake of being able to dribble. But these are early days with those studies, so we don't know if the results will hold up. Anything else?
Just one more, but I think I'll hold it.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Going back to the literacy and some children not having that ability in the early years to be able to read, I missed whether or not you listed any references for the research that indicates that.
Oh, I'm being able to read early?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't list references. I have to send them to you because I don't know them off the top of my head. But the case of Finland is a great example, where they're not learning to read till they're 7, and by 4 they're better in language, arts, and math, and all the other things, science, than kids all around the world. Of course, it's not perfect because you have a more homogeneous population in Finland, etc., but at least it suggests that it's not impeding their development. Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you said that, because I'm a speech language pathologist and we have norms for articulation or speech sound production, right? And I've always, from a clinical gut instinct perspective, felt that some kids just aren't ready. Like there's a span, and some kids develop it at the beginning of the span, some near the end, and some after, to be perfectly honest. And I felt that it's very closely related. We know speech sound production is related to literacy, and the same thing, right? Like some kids will get those rhyming skills at a certain milestone, and others, it's just one of those things, if you try to work on it too early, it's like banging your head against a wall. So despite, not having had a ton of experience with literacy, it makes perfect sense. It fits with what we see clinically as well.
Great, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to go on. Okay, the third core executive function is cognitive flexibility. Being able to see an issue from different perspectives, think about something in a whole new way, seamlessly adjust to change or the unexpected. So, for example, guys, in what way is a carrot like a cucumber? Somebody?
Tubular.
Okay, tubular. Okay, you're not allowed to use the same answer again for any other question. In what way is a carrot like an orange, somebody? Good, excellent. In what way is a carrot like a potato? Grows underground, excellent. In what way is a carrot like an apple? Crunchy, okay. So it just gives you an idea of thinking about a carrot in slightly different ways, okay? Cognitive flexibility includes the flexibility to take advantage of a sudden opportunity. Maybe you had plans to do one thing, but now an opportunity has come up to do something else. Do you want to rigidly stay with your plans, or do you want to stay open to maybe taking advantage of this new opportunity? The ability to get around problems that you encounter on the way to being able to succeed. Maybe the road you wanted to take to sick kids was closed today, and how are you going to find a different way to get to your goal? Maybe you ran out of money in trying to accomplish something. How are you going to try to accomplish it anyway, even though it turned out to be more expensive than you thought? Or even to admit you were wrong when you get more information. Einstein said, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. Can you creatively see the same thing from different perspectives? For example, what unusual, crazy, outside the box uses can you think of for a table? Right? You can write on a table, you can eat on a table. What insane things can you do with a table? Right? Like maybe use it as a raft. So you could hide under it. You can turn it on its side to protect you at things people are throwing at you, like maybe snowballs. You could turn it upside down to play horseshoes. Use it as a percussion instrument or cut it up for firewood. It's just a matter of thinking outside the box. How can we stop ourselves from getting really upset when a child misbehaves? What we usually get upset about is the intent that we think is behind the behavior. But we can use cognitive flexibility to reframe. Maybe a child is acting in that incredibly awful way because the child's been terribly hurt. And the child's going to push you away before you have a chance to push him away. Or maybe he's going to test you to see if you're really somebody he can feel safe with. If we see the misbehavior is coming from hurt, we can react completely differently. We used to think prefrontal cortex was silent during infancy, but we've learned that babies can problem solve and reason even before they can speak. And Agnes Kovacs years ago did a study on children. These were Romanian infants whose parents were all bilingual. Some parents decided always to speak just one language at home. And some parents decided that one parent would always speak one language and one parent would always speak the other language. And what they found was by 7 months of age, that the children showed better ability to switch, a better ability to inhibit an old way of doing things if they had been exposed to 2 languages growing up. So the bilingual babies already at 7 months of age showed better cognitive flexibility and inhibitory control. Okay, an example of a test that assesses cognitive flexibility. I'm going to come back again to the object retrieval task. So here's an 8-month-old, and she's got a problem. She sees the toy, she sees her pacifier through the top of the box, but the front is open. And she needs to be able to look in the opening in order to succeed. At 8 months, she's going to reach where she's looking. So she needs to be able to look in the opening to succeed. So how is she going to succeed? So she creatively problem solves and she pushes the front of the box up. The box has no bottom. She's got a huge opening now. She can reach in and get the toy. And that's exactly what she does. So that's creative problem solving, cognitive flexibility. If I have a problem, I need to be able to look in the side I'm reaching. How can I transform this so that I can succeed? Okay, so she does something to creatively problem solve. The only problem is she doesn't yet have the bimanual coordination to continue to hold the box up with one hand when she goes down to reach in with the other. And so what happens is the box comes down. So now she hasn't quite got to the pacifier, and she sees everything through the top of the box again. And unfortunately, she's stuck. She takes her hand out of the box and reaches to the top. So she still doesn't have great inhibitory control, but at least you can see the beginnings of problem solving. By 9 months of age, you see more successful problem solving. So here, the left or right side is open. That's much harder. They need to lean over and look in the box and continue to look in. So what they do is they recruit the contralateral hand. We call it the awkward reach because it looks incredibly awkward, right? Why not elegantly sit up and reach with the near hand? But if they did that, she'd be looking through the closed side and she couldn't succeed. So again, this is creative problem solving on both sides of the box. It's not a hand preference. She leans over to look in and she succeeds in getting the toy. So again, she can't get it if she hasn't looked in. She only about half the time gets it if she doesn't continue to look in. But if she can stay down there and continue to look in the side, she'll almost always succeed. And this just says what I told you. Okay, shifting mental sets requires that you inhibit the old way and you activate the new way into working memory. So it builds on both working memory and inhibitory control. And there are lots of card sorting tasks. Wisconsin card sort is a common one for adults. This dimensional change card sort developed by Phil Zalazzo, who used to be at the University of Toronto, is a very simple version of a card sort. So when you're sorting by color, the blue truck goes with the blue star. But when you're sorting by shape, you have to switch now. And that same blue truck goes with the red truck. 3-year-olds can sort perfectly by color or shape. No problem. The problem comes when you have to switch. 3-year-olds rarely can switch. So I want to show you what that looks like when you're switching from color to shape and when shape to color. Because it's not that they prefer sorting by one way. It doesn't matter which way you start. Whatever way you start is the way they want to continue to do it. In the first video, you're going to see an unusually verbal little girl who tells you what she's thinking as she's doing it.
This is the star. Where does it go? Go ahead. So point, show me where the trucks go. Excellent. And where do the stars go? Good job. This is a truck. Where does it go? Go ahead. So trucks go here and stars go here. Here we go, Caleb. This is a star. Where does it go? Excellent. Okay. Now we're going to start playing a color game. Remember, in the color game, red ones go here and blue ones go here. So this is a blue one. Where does it go? Go ahead. There's a track on it. Well, remember, we're playing the color game. In the color game, blue ones go here and red ones go here. So this is a blue one. Where does it go? Put it where you think it goes. There's a track. Where do you think it goes? Put it where you think it goes. Then take it and put it there. Okay. So point to where the blue ones go. Very good. And where do the red ones go? Very nice. This is the red one. Where does it go? Go ahead. Where do you think it goes? Oh, this has a star on it. So it has to be going in here. Whichever one you think. I think this one. If that's what you think, that's right there. Okay. So remember, in the color game, blue ones go here and red ones go here. This is a blue one. Where does it go? Well, it has a truck. Where do you think it goes? It doesn't have a start. It has to be going in here. Okay. So point, show me where the red ones go. And where do the blue ones go? Excellent. Very nice. This is a blue one. Where does it go? Put it where you think. Go ahead. That's a truck, so it has a blue truck.
Okay, so the next one is starting with color.
The blue ones go here, the red ones go here. This one's red, where does it go? We did. Where did the blue ones go? Beautiful. Where do the red ones go? Awesome, you got it. You're so good at this. This one's blue. Where does it go? The red ones go here, the blue ones go here. This one's red. Where does it go? Where do the blue ones go? Awesome. Where do the red ones go? Amazing. Very good. This one's blue. Where does it go? Okay, so we're not going to play the color game anymore. We're going to play the shape game again. Remember the shape game? The trucks go here, the stars go here. Where do the trucks go? Good job. Where do the stars go? All right, high five. High five for that one. This one's a star. Where does it go? The trucks go here, the stars go here. This one's a truck. Where does it go? Where do the trucks go? Where do the stars go? Where do the trucks go? Perfect. This one's a star. Where does it go?
Okay, as you saw, the child has clearly in mind how to play this game before the stimulus card appears. The child knows what dimension we're doing, how to sort by that dimension. The child's got it down pat. And then that stupid stimulus card appears, which is relevant not only to the current dimension, but to the old one. And it pulls the child back to thinking in terms of the first dimension. And we call that attentional inertia. Once they focus their attention on a dimension, their attention gets stuck there. They need to disengage from or inhibit their previous way of thinking about the stimuli. It's not enough to know something and remember it. You have to get that knowledge into your behavior. People have assumed that if children knew what they should do, well, then obviously they would do it. And if they didn't do it, they were intentionally misbehaving. But between knowing and implementing, another step long ignored is often needed. When there's a strong competing response, that response has to be inhibited. Young children may not be able to do that. A child may know what he or she should do and want to do that, but still not be able to act accordingly. Now, in the card sort you saw, each dimension is an intrinsic property of the stimulus object. So, for example, the truck here is not only a truck, it's also a red thing. It has two properties. What would happen if color were a property of the background so that the truck is always a truck? Color and shape are still on the card, but color and shape are not a property of the same thing. They're not a property of the truck. The truck is always a truck and the background is always red. So we tried that, and what we found is that twice as many children succeed if you use the separated dimensions than if you use the integrated, because they don't have to switch how they think about the truck or the star. And they succeeded roughly 6 months earlier. As you can see, nothing much helps the 2.5-year-olds. They really can't do it yet, but it really makes a big difference for the 3s and the 3.5s and the 4s. At the same time we did this, a group in Austria did it a different way. So now it's not the background, it's a sphere on the card that's carrying the color. And here they're separated a little bit more so the stimulus doesn't overlap with the color. And you find that here's their results, here's our results in the blue. So you can see that with they find the same thing we found, but they find it a little bit more extreme. They find it helps even a little bit more if they're a little bit more separated on the card. But the difference is very minor between theirs and ours. And there's a third kind of test you can do, which is called the reversal task. Here you take color out altogether. In the original task, stars go with stars and trucks go with truck. And then you play a silly game where the trucks go in the star bin and the stars go in the truck bin. And what you find is that children can do reversals already at 2.5 years of age. If they don't have to switch dimensions, then 2.5-year-olds can do it. If they have to switch dimensions, if it's separated on the card, they can do it by 3.5. If you do the basic card sort, where color is a property of the shape, and so that the same thing is both red and a truck, now they succeed at 4.5. But those are single task blocks. So you have a block of color, and then you switch to a block of shape. You have one switch trial. If you have a mixed block, where randomly you're going to have to switch between color and shape, children can't normally reliably do that till they're 7.5 years of age. People have come up with little variants where they make it easier and you can do it earlier, but in the regular task where it's just a mixed block, children can't really do it till they're 7.5 or 8.5 years of age. Comes in much later. For practicing all 3 core executive functions in young children, a great way is social pretend play. And Vygotsky suggested this years ago. So if you're doing, let's say, cops and robbers, you have to remember what role you picked and what role your friends picked, right? Because if you're planning the robbery, you don't want to accidentally tell the cop. I mean, that would be terrible. You have to remember who's who. You have to inhibit acting out of character. So if you're doing a family scenario and you're the baby in this little skit, you can't all of a sudden get up and drive the fancy car. You have to stay in character. And your friends may take this scenario in ways you never imagined because everybody's improvising. So on the fly, in real time, you have to flexibly adjust. You're using working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, and you're just playing. So there are 3 core executive functions: inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And from those, higher order executive functions are built, like problem solving, reasoning, and planning. And problem solving and reasoning are what fluid intelligence consists of. So it's no surprise that executive functions correlate over 0.9 with fluid intelligence, because fluid intelligence is essentially a higher order executive function. Executive functions can be assessed and executive functions can be improved at any age, from early infancy through old age. And I just wanted to thank you very much. I'm now at slide 450. Wow. So I just wanted to make sure I stayed within my 2-hour allotment, and it looks like I could have even packed more slides in, but my husband thought I was being crazy. So there's plenty of time now for questions.
So going back to the challenge of Blue Truck and Blue Star, why is it they can't switch back or from that initial?
You don't know anything more than I know. It looks like they focused on that this stimulus gets sorted with the ones of the same first property. And what you find in even adults, I mean, we can switch from color to shape, but if I gave you a lot of trials over a whole session, you stay faster on the trials by the first way you sorted. So if you start sorting by color, you're faster on the colored trials for the whole session. If you start sorting with a block of shape, you're faster on the shape trials for the whole session.
Amazing. This really makes you think about when you ask a child to do 5 different things, and how much do you expect them to actually remember and be able to do? It's really interesting that how it correlates to developmental capabilities.
Right.
And fantastic.
And also you see the inertia even in adults where we tend to stay stuck with the first.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. So it's like tied to cognitive bias.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Okay, so a couple of other questions from online. So if we're thinking about trauma and like cortisol flooding, that sort of thing, can you point us to any studies, or do you have any sort of knowledge of that sort of?
Oh yes, that could be a whole nother talk. So stress impairs executive functions. Prefrontal cortex is the last area of the brain to have evolved, and it's the last area of the brain to mature over a person's life. It's the most vulnerable area of the brain. The older areas of the brain have had much more time to consolidate everything. And prefrontal cortex is located in a vulnerable area here in the front. If you're sad, if you're stressed, if you're lonely, if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not physically healthy, prefrontal cortex and executive functions take the first hit and the biggest hit. So your executive functions are much worse if you're stressed. You may have noticed that when you're stressed, you can't think as clearly or exercise as good self-control. It's true of everyone. And one thing that I'm concerned about is that clinicians always assess the stress in a child's current life and history before diagnosing ADHD, because a child can look like he or she has an executive function impairment like ADHD when the child doesn't. The child is simply stressed or been through great stress. But executive functions can also help you cope with stress. So, for example, if there's danger in the environment, your amygdala in the brain starts screaming. The amygdala is your alarm system if there's any reason to be afraid. But prefrontal cortex can tell the amygdala to calm down if there really isn't danger in the environment. So if you see photos of faces that express fear or anger, the amygdala lights up. But prefrontal cortex can then get activated and cause the amygdala to stop firing, to calm down. Unfortunately, children who've been exposed to multiple adverse childhood experiences, multiple ACEs, lose the capacity of prefrontal cortex to calm down the amygdala. If you're stressed or I'm stressed, during the time we're stressed, prefrontal cortex can't communicate as well with the rest of the areas of the brain. But as soon as that stress subsides, that problem goes away. But if when you were growing up, you had chronic severe stress, then the development of the brain changes. So the communication between prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is disrupted. And unless there's significant intervention, it stays disrupted. So in adults who have been through early adverse experiences, their amygdala gets more activated when they see a fearful face or an angry face. But when prefrontal activation comes in, the amygdala activation doesn't go down. Prefrontal is doing its job. It's getting more activated, but the amygdala activation isn't correspondingly getting reduced. The message doesn't get through from prefrontal to the amygdala. So studies of, in adults, the disruption of communication between prefrontal and the rest of the areas of the brain. One of those studies is by Liston with Bruce McEwen and BJ Casey. One of the studies of the amygdala getting activated when you see an angry face or a fearful face, and prefrontal causing the amygdala to then stop firing when there's no reason to be upset, is work out of Matt Lieberman's lab at UCLA. And a study showing that in adults who have been through multiple ACEs, that you don't see that prefrontal cortex gets more active, but the amygdala activation continues, is work by Shelley Taylor in Matt Lieberman's lab, at UCLA. So it's Shelley Taylor's the first author, Matt Lieberman is the senior author. Also, stress, even mild stress, causes dopamine to flood prefrontal cortex. So many areas of the brain need dopamine as a neurotransmitter, but only in prefrontal cortex in response to mild stress do you see this huge spike in dopamine. So it's like prefrontal cortex gets flooded by dopamine. It gets swamped, so it can't function properly, even though it needs dopamine in order to function. Too much is no good. Also, there are more receptors for cortisol in prefrontal cortex than in any other region of the primate brain. So prefrontal cortex is going to be more affected by cortisol than any other region of the brain. So stress has huge effects on executive function.
That's great. It really helps to sort of tie in a lot of the stuff that we've been learning so far in this series as well, to back to the simple tasks of life, right? It's fantastic. Okay, one more question. So if a parent has impaired executive functioning, how does that reflect to the development of the child? Or does it?
Yes. So children are very affected by their parents. And if a parent has poor executive function, the child, it depends on where the executive dysfunction is, but the home may be more disorganized. The parent may not be able to rely on the parent to remember everything the parent's supposed to do. So the child's life can be a little bit more unpredictable and unreliable. The parent might be more likely to fly off the handle if the child not be able to exercise his good self-control. So it's challenging for the child. And often you find a child with executive function problems has at least one parent with executive function problems. So it's good for people to be aware of where they have shortcomings and to try to do something about them. So if you have executive function problems, there are 3 things you can do. One is you can work on trying to improve them, like work on trying to exercise self-control or work on trying to remember. Another thing you can do is try to reduce the things in your life that might be impairing the executive functions you have, like reducing the stress in your life or getting more sleep. And the third thing you can do is try to scaffold yourself. So for example, you don't have to hold everything in working memory. It's perfectly fine to take notes, for example. You don't have to challenge your inhibitory control to the max all the time. For example, you can put the fattening food in the back of the fridge so you don't see it when you open the fridge. There are lots of things you can do to reduce the executive functions demands on yourself, to scaffold yourself, so that it doesn't mean that your executive functions are going to improve, but your functioning that requires executive functions will improve. So you can work on trying to improve the executive function. You can work on trying to minimize things that impair it or maximize things that help it function better. And you can try to scaffold yourself, to bootstrap yourself. So even though you recognize you have a shortcoming, you find ways to minimize the disruptions because of it.
And I think this is going to be the last question from online. Going back to the card sorting again, have they tried doing it with a time delay in between so that they have time to acclimatize themselves to the new rules?
They've tried short delays, and that hasn't worked. But waiting a whole day helps, and going into a different room helps, so it's a different context. Maybe that's also a little bit longer delay than they've used if you're in the same room. But the more you break it up, the more likely it is the child's going to be able to succeed. The more you emphasize that this is different, the more likely the child is to succeed.